Sabbath, and that Sabbath breaking was one of the many sins of Christians, and that as Christians we ought to faithfully keep the Sabbath every Sunday. Keep it holy, keep it separate, keep it distinct from all the other days of the week, and not to do any work on Sundays. I remember through my studies my studies for osteopathy and trying to balance that pressure of exams on Mondays with my tendency for last-minute preparation, and the pressure to work on Sundays was extreme, but throughout the whole thing, I said, I'm not going to work on Sundays. And I never did. And I did so believing that I was keeping the Sabbath. I ought to put my cards on the table this evening for you and tell you I no longer do believe that Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. But I'm going to back up from the whole question and ask the question that really comes out of our study in Genesis. We're working our way through Genesis in the mornings. If you've missed it, you can catch up online. Come join us. But on Sunday morning last week, we were in Genesis chapter 2, and the first 3 verses where we read that thus the heavens and the earth were finished and all the host of them. And on the 7th day, that would be Saturday, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. And I mentioned in passing last week, I tried to expound that text in context, tried to give you what I felt was the sense of the text in context, trying to show how God leaves day 7 unfinished and leaves us hanging, and the purpose for that rest being God taking delight in all his creation and being refreshed by it, and tried to lay that all out for you. But all of that as it is, many Christians, you must acknowledge, come to this verse and say, well, look, right here we have the earliest example of Sabbath, a Sabbath institution. God setting apart one day of the week and making it holy. Here we are, they say, it's a creation ordinance, and as a creation ordinance, it's something that Christians have to keep. To cut a long introduction short, I'm going to try to show you that that's not the case. I'm going to speak about the reasons I believe the Sabbath is not a creation ordinance, is not a creation command. That's my first point tonight. And then I'll talk about what the Sabbath command was, that it was a covenant command to the people of Israel. And then we'll talk about, what did that look like? Why did God give the Sabbath command to Israel? And we'll talk about then, in conclusion, the Mosaic covenant as a whole and how that applies to us. And we'll see how far we get. So if you're with me, we're going to go through a whole raft of scriptures this evening, not just focusing, as is our habit, narrowly on one text and digging in deep. I'm going to go broadly, and we're going to cover it in this topical manner. So I hope you're following with me. I hope you understand the question. Are Christians supposed to keep the Sabbath as an institution? Well, first of all, I'm going to say that no, the Sabbath is not a creation command. The Sabbath is not a creation ordinance. And you say, well, Tom, how can you say that? Well, first of all, to be a creation command, it has to actually be a command. Well, that would be fairly obvious, wouldn't it? But you say, well, okay, where's the command here? And that's my point. Chapter 2 in Genesis, this is the creation account. And we've got the record of the seventh day. We've got the record of God blessing the seventh day in verse 3 and making it holy because on it he rested from all the work that he had done in creation. But you say, Tom, where's the command? And I say, absolutely, there is no command. It's talking about what God did, what God said, but not what God said to man. Now, if you want a creation command, you go back to verse 28, where it says, God blessed them, that's male and female, that he just created. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. You say, well, that's a creation command. He said, do this. Now, what's absent in the whole Sabbath idea in chapter 2 and verses 1 to 3 is that there is no creation command as such. Also later on, and so I say, first of all, to be a creation command, it has to be a command. It's not. It's talking about what God said, what God did, and what he did to the day. Now, let me just add this. The later Sabbath commands that accompany the teaching of the Sabbath for the people of Israel, the whole concept of the Sabbath, would be totally pointless at this stage in creation. We're talking about the time in chapter 2, which is before the fall in chapter 3, and work is not toilsome, and there's no need, as it were, to command one day of rest in 7, and certainly there is no command, although God does put the man in the garden in chapter 2 to work there and to keep it. So there's work given, but there's no command, you must rest every seventh day, given along with the command to work. Now, could they? Did they? Well, the answer is, of course, we don't know because it's not written. But if you do go on in the book of Exodus and you ask the question, well, what was the Sabbath to be like? What did that not working look like? Well, it looked like stopping from labor. It looked like refusing to carry a burden. If you look at the book of Nehemiah and the book of Jeremiah, you can find commands, we'll look at those later, not to bear a burden, not to carry a burden on the Sabbath day. It looked like a command not to kindle a fire on the Sabbath. And you say, well, actually, if you go back to Genesis and the idyllic situation that we're in, they've got all the food just to pick off the tree. They're on a raw kind of fruit and veg diet. There's no mention of fire. There's no mention of cooking. There's no mention of prohibitions. They wouldn't need a fire to keep warm. This is obviously the climate in the Garden of Eden was very obviously the exact same climate as exists in the Canary Islands, because that's perfect as far as I'm concerned. But there was no problem needing heat. Actually, the Canary Islands can get quite cold in the evening and sometimes of year, but not in Eden. This was the perfect environment. The commands that go along with the Sabbath later on involve the capital punishment for violating it, and someone is put to death because they pick up sticks on the Sabbath. Again, the whole picture in Eden doesn't fit that, and so I say it makes no sense that to say that the Sabbath command was a creation ordinance, and was, in that sense, eternal, something which has always been there in the background. And that's what some people would say. Contrary to that, I'm going to point out to you that the Sabbath as an institution, in fact, the word Sabbath, you only ever meet it, first of all, in the Bible, in Exodus chapter 16. Perhaps you want to turn there. Exodus chapter 16. You'll need a Bible. We're going to be doing a lot of page turning this evening. But in Exodus chapter 16, verse 22, it says, on the sixth day, this is talking about the time when God provided manna for them, and quail, quail in verse 13, quail came up and covered the camp, but then also in verse 14, the manna, and we're talking about the manna now. So in verse 22, on the sixth day, they gathered twice as much bread, that's manna, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept until the morning. So they laid it aside till the morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink. Did you remember the story here where if they kept any beyond the day, they were to eat what they gathered that day, and they were to leave none till morning? They were only to gather as much as they needed. And if they did keep any till the next day, it stank, it rotted. But in this case, no, it did not stink. And Moses said, not only did it not stink, there were no worms in it. And verse 25, and Moses said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord, and you will not find it in the field. 6 days shall you gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none. Now, I want to point out to you, this is one thing that I do sometimes when I go through my Bible, just in my own Bible reading, I take a pencil in my hand, and whenever I went through this, and it was many years ago, I'd circle the word a, because if you see that in verse 23, it says, tomorrow is a solemn rest, a holy Sabbath. In verse 25, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Verse 26, 6 days shall you gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none. But now as we come down to verse 29, we read, see, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you bread for 2 days. And that's the first mention of the Sabbath in the whole Bible. This passage is the first mention of the word Sabbath in the Bible. And it's interesting that it's introduced to the people of Israel as a Sabbath, a Sabbath, a Sabbath. And then finally, look, says God, the Lord, Jehovah, has given you the Sabbath, and therefore he gives you the bread for 2 days. So he's teaching them. Now, if you get the idea that he's teaching them, you've really not got a problem, because then you understand, well, of course he's teaching them, because he's introducing law to his people, and he's doing it progressively. If you go to the book of Nehemiah, now you will want to find your way here, so go through, flick forwards in the Bible, go through Joshua, Judges, go through Samuel, go through Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, find your way to the book of Nehemiah, and in chapter 9 in Nehemiah, this is the great chapter in which Nehemiah leads the people in prayer and confession of sin. And as he's doing so, he's recounting to the people of Israel their own history. And this is now, if you're with me in the history of the Bible, this is the time of the return from exile. The people of Israel had been in the land for many hundreds of years. They'd sinned. They'd been sent into exile by God. They'd been in exile for 70 years. Now they'd returned to the land, and Nehemiah is supervising the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. Are you with me? The book of Nehemiah, chapter 9. Now let's pick up the reading in verse, let's pick it up in verse 12. Nehemiah, as he leads them in prayer, he's recounting God's works. By a pillar of cloud you led them in the day, and by a pillar of fire in the night, to light for them the way which they should go. What's he talking about? He's talking about the Exodus and the wandering through the wilderness. Verse 13, you came down on Mount Sinai and spoke with them from heaven and gave them right rules and true laws, good statutes and commandments. What's he talking about? Mount Sinai and God speaking the 10 commandments and giving Moses all those laws. And verse 14, so helpful. And you made known to them your holy Sabbath. There it is, singular, the Sabbath. And commanded them commandments and statutes and a law by Moses your servant, and you gave them bread from heaven, and so on. And on goes Nehemiah's prayer. But in the middle of Nehemiah's prayer, says Nehemiah, oh God, there was this time when you revealed the law from Mount Sinai. And says Nehemiah, that at that time, in that context, you made known to them your Sabbath. Implication, well, they didn't know about it before. Implication, actually, the Sabbath is not a creation command. Actually, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you should never prove things by silence in the Bible, but it is interesting to work your way through the Bible from Genesis chapter 1 to Exodus chapter 16 and notice that there's no mention ever of any of God's people keeping the Sabbath. In fact, there's no mention of the Sabbath. There's no mention of any laws of the Sabbath. There's no instruction on it. There's no example of it. There's no mention in the Bible. Now, you say it's an argument from silence. No, it's not. I've made my point. It wasn't a creation command. It was taught to them at Mount Sinai. Are you with me? That's helpful because let's learn something from that. In fact, we can learn something as a general principle. Progressive revelation. If God reveals things to us as his people, and if he did that with his people in the Bible times, if he reveals things to them progressively, that means, the law is something which is progressive sometimes. Now, I'm going to make a point here. Not every law is eternal. In other words, what is sin once the law has come was not sin before the law came. Are you with me? In Genesis 2, we only get one prohibition. In Genesis 2, there's only one you shall not, and it's to do with the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's just one clause, one great big but, says God. And plenty of positive commands, be fruitful and multiply in Genesis 1. There's plenty of implications from what God says here that we can take away and apply in our lives, and we can make into our own rules if we want to, but there's no command from God. Are you with me? It's not a creation ordinance. Now, I say all of that at length and quite categorically, because you can go to some very, very good, very biblical teachers, people I absolutely love and respect and hope to be more like as I grow in godliness. And you can hear them talk about this as a creation command, as a creation ordinance. And they'll go to Genesis 2 and just kind of mention that as if it's QED, case proved. Look, God rested. There we are. We've got the Sabbath in Genesis 2. Well, actually, no. Some laws, yes. Some laws are eternal by virtue of their moral nature, you could say. Like, you shall not murder. There's no mention of you shall not murder in Genesis 2 either. But it's very obvious that God saw murder as wrong. He dealt with Cain in chapter 4, and he dealt with him according to the fact that he had murdered his brother. But it's very interesting that he didn't put the capital punishment onto Cain. And the capital punishment that he prescribes for murder, God prescribes for murder in Exodus and Leviticus, is not applied in Genesis chapter 4. And that's interesting, isn't it? That even that sin, there's progressive revelation, and with progressive revelation comes more accountability, more consequences. Are you with me? Other laws, however, are not really eternal because they don't have any intrinsic moral nature. You could go, I won't take you there, you could go to the early chapters of Deuteronomy, and you could look at the command, for instance, that the Lord himself will show them the place where he is to be worshipped, and that is the place in which they're to worship. It's going to be ultimately in Jerusalem. God is going to specify, and you must go there, and the worship must be in that place and in that place alone. God is going to unify the nation. Well, before that command came, it was okay for them to worship in different places, wasn't it? And before the erection of the tabernacle, it was okay for people to offer sacrifice in their families, as Job did with his family as a kind of priest in his own household. And so we've got progressive law giving progressive commandment, but it doesn't go backwards. And so you cannot say, look, Genesis 2 mentions God resting on the seventh day. QED, we have a creation command for the Sabbath. Okay, I've tried to prove that to you. Let's leave that there as a done deal, shall we? Well, secondly, I'm going to say that the Sabbath was, however, a covenant command. Now, first of all, I've said the Sabbath was not a creation command. Now I'm saying that it was, however, a covenant command. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that it was part of a covenant. I read Exodus chapter 20 and the 10 Commandments to you earlier, and we ought to just revisit that momentarily. Verse 8, here is the Sabbath command, and it is a command. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. By the way, that 6 days, anyone that wants to kind of say that we need to keep the Sabbath ought also to be working 6 days, not 5. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock or your sojourner, or the sojourner within your gates. I mentioned this on Wednesday night, how hypocritical it is. And you go to Israel and they're happy to have Goyim, they're happy to have the Gentiles doing work for them on the Sabbath whilst they take the Sabbath to rest. It's actually, nobody's supposed to do any work if you're going to follow this. Nobody at all, not even your livestock or the sojourner within your gates. And the reason is given, for in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Certainly the command here is grounded, is linked back to the fact that God set apart the seventh day and blessed it. It says, therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And that's us blessing the Sabbath day now within the law, but this is a new creation, you would say, the creation of a Sabbath, and then it becoming the Sabbath in Exodus chapter 16. So by now, in Exodus chapter 20, he's already telling them, remember the Sabbath day, not let me tell you about the Sabbath day, but remember the Sabbath day. And he's talking about the Sabbath day as something that they know, and he's saying the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And so what was the Sabbath day? The Sabbath day was which day of the week? The seventh day. The seventh day is a Saturday, and there's no question that it was a command not to work. Not any work, and not nobody work, and not all day. There are all sorts of prohibitions. I just pulled this off the Gospel Coalition website. Kindling a fire, Exodus 35:3. Gathering manna, Exodus 16:23-29. Selling goods, Nehemiah 10:31, 13:15-22. Bearing burdens, Jeremiah 17:19-27. Did you get all those? You can get the recording. It's worth realizing that there were lots of these prescriptions. You mustn't do this. You mustn't do this. You remember the story of the guy who then, immediately after they had the Sabbath law, was out gathering sticks, and they saw him, and they brought him in and they killed him, right? Execution for breaking the Sabbath. Is that a little bit severe? Does that put some kind of what can we say? Theocratic shivers down your spine? Does that make you think, wow, I'm glad I wasn't living under that law? Why so severe? I mean, why such a penalty, the death penalty for breaking the Sabbath? I mean, it seems like a small thing to go out and gather some sticks on the seventh day of the week. Why such a serious deal? Well, I'm going to say it's because it was a covenant command. Actually, it was the heart of the covenant command. Now, I haven't had time to check this, but I'm told that if you count backwards from the end of the Ten Commandments in Hebrew and forwards from the beginning of the Ten Commandments in Hebrew, right there in the very center of all the words numerically is the command to keep the Sabbath holy. It's something Seventh-day Adventists love to point out, that this is the central command of the Ten Commandments that were given to the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. And you say, well, why did God give that command to his people? Okay, a couple of reasons. Well, first of all, it did lock in for God's people the cycle of 7 days. God obviously, you would say, wanted to lock that in. That was his creation design, a 7-day week. You know that there's been a few attempts over the years, down through the centuries, to have a different length week. Why 7 days? Interesting, isn't it? There's no reason astronomically why 7 days, but people have tried different things. Napoleon, at the French Revolution, they tried to get rid of Sunday, basically. They said, we're going to get rid of Sunday. And they made a 10-day week. And it lasted about, 12 years. Napoleon finally got rid of it. It was so unpopular. It's not difficult to see why it would be unpopular. If you got 1 day off every 10 days as opposed to every 7 days, Interestingly, the Soviets did the same, but they made it a 5-day week. And in true Soviet style, they decided we're going to get rid of the names of the days of the week and we're just going to call them colors. and we're gonna have everything so well organized that different people, and we just assign your day off, a different day off. So Yanu, you get blue off, but Jenny just gets yellow off, so you never see each other. And that worked really, really, really well, and they got rid of it after, I think, a few more than 12 years, but it was abysmal. Their idea was to increase productivity. I think they discovered that when you destroy families, you don't do well. But basically, God designed a 7-day week. That's Genesis chapter 1. And there's the 7-day cycle kind of built into the fabric of our existence. It's always been that way as far back as you can go. And God wanted to kind of seal the deal, you might say, by putting it into the law for his people so that everybody got 1 day off, rest in the week. And you can, it's interesting, you can go to the commands in Exodus. I won't take you there now, but to the people of Israel to keep the Sabbath and see that God specifies it so that your servant is going to be able to rest and be refreshed. And God was having, you could say, mercy upon the people who are in the employment and even on the animals in the nation of Israel, so that you didn't have those slave masters, Bradford, who would make you work 7 days a week if they could with a paintbrush in your hand. It was just not going to happen under God's rule. So that's a kind of a by the way, and I think that is a by the way. You say, well, why did God give the Sabbath to the people of Israel? Well, I think that's a by the way, that he wanted to set up a good system for his people, which was according to his design, and enshrine it in their law, because they were a messed up bunch just like everyone else, and chances are they would change it if they could. But I think there's a bigger principle here, and I want to point this out, that the Sabbath itself served as the sign of the covenant. Now, come with me here. The question is, why would you stone a Sabbath breaker to death as a community? Why would you execute someone for picking up sticks on Sunday? Come on, Moses, it can't be that serious, can it? Well, follow with me here. Turn to Exodus 31. Exodus 31. Exodus 31, we're into the kind of exposition on the law that follows Exodus 20. You've got the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, and then there's so many extra commands and details given which kind of fill out and add detail. Exodus 31, there's a section here, begins in verse 12, which deals with the Sabbath. And the Lord said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, and this is interesting, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths. Why? I mean, above all, really? Above all, says God, you shall keep my Sabbaths. For this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. Therefore, the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel, that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. And on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. Now let me take you back to verse 13. Above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. What are we doing here? We're saying that the reason keeping the Sabbath for the people of Israel was so important that it required the death penalty for Sabbath breakers is because this was the sign of the covenant. You say, Tom, well, what's the sign of the covenant? Well, back up. What are some of the signs of covenants? What is a covenant? Maybe you're like me. I remember hearing my pastor preach a whole sermon on the covenants. And I spent the whole sermon going, I don't know what a covenant is. And it really drove me crazy. I got to the end of the sermon, I still didn't know what a covenant was. Don't tell him that if ever you see him. But this young man was very frustrated. Maybe you don't know what a covenant is. A covenant is an agreement with an oath between two parties. And there's a promise made. There can be stipulations, there can be agreements specified, but it's with that committed nature that comes with an oath, with a very solemn agreement with an oath attached to it. And you say, well, like what? Well, okay, like, let's say in Genesis chapter 9, flip back there. Genesis chapter 9. And God speaking to Noah, and after the flood waters have receded, and in verses 1 to 8, 1 to 7, Noah sacrifices, actually in chapter 8, verse 20 onwards, Noah sacrifices, God smells the pleasing aroma, and then God makes a covenant with Noah. Verse 9 is interesting because verse 9 and 10 is the covenant not just with Noah, but with all of humanity. Look at this. Then God said to Noah and his sons with him, behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds and the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you that, and here it comes, never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Now, that's quite a promise, isn't it? God had done it once. If it was a local flood, by the way, God didn't keep his promise, did he? If it was a local flood, not a global flood, there's been lots of local floods since then. But now he's saying, no, never again will all flesh be cut off. I'm not going to destroy the world with a flood anymore. There's not going to be no more global floods, says God, no matter what the global warming levels raise to. By the way, I've heard some Christians use this verse very badly to say that we don't have to worry about rising sea levels. Just word of caution, sea levels have risen and fallen over the history of the world, and they say there's nothing here to say that sea levels won't rise or fall again in our future, and we shouldn't use verses of the Bible carelessly. Let me just say that. Don't throw a verse at the Bible like this at an argument, even if the argument is faulty. Don't just throw a verse at it carelessly, as you hear some people do. But leaving that aside, God promised, never again will I flood the entire earth. Okay? Simple. And God said, this is a sign. Verse 12. Genesis 9, verse 12. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. And here it comes. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the cloud, what happens? Who's the sign for? So interesting. I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature and all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living. I mean, this is great, isn't it? This is just dead simple. You want to know what a sign of a covenant is? A sign of a covenant is something very visible, very tangible, concrete, something you can point to and say, okay, now I see that, now I think about that, I remember the whole package. There's been an agreement. There has been a deal struck. There's a promise been made. On this part, okay, the Noahic covenant. Who are the parties to the covenant? God. The immortal God, the omnipotent God who did flood the world, made the promise. Was it a conditional promise? No, it was unconditional. Did it have stipulations? Did they say, if, you do this, you do that? No, none of that, just, I will not. And here is the sign. Now, but if you come to the covenant between God and the people of Israel in Exodus chapter 20, there are some stipulations, aren't there? And there's some deal making going on here. You must, we agree. These are the rules. These are the rules. And here's the sign. But before we get there, let's have a look at Genesis chapter 12. Turn over the page. Now, God made a few promises to Abraham. Genesis 12. Now the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And, here it comes, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's a lot of blessing. Where's the stipulations? Oh, there aren't any. Then verse 7. And the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your offspring, that's to your descendants, I will give this land. It's amazing. It's like a promise of land, seed, blessing. Well, then you can go over to, let's have a look at chapter 15. And Abraham's worried because he hasn't got any offspring. Abraham said in verse 3, behold, you've given me no offspring. And in verse 5, God took him outside and said, look towards heaven, number the stars if you're able to number them. And he said, so shall your offspring be. And where's the condition there? There's no condition. There's going to be just endless descendants for Abraham. It's part of the condition. And then verse 13. The Lord said to Abraham, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in the land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions, and so on. You say, well, verse 18. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, to the river Euphrates, to the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, and the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Try saying that in a hurry. What's the point? God promised them a land, a specific land. He promised Abraham descendants, innumerable descendants. And he promised Abraham blessing. And he made it all with this covenant. A covenant What was the sign of the, we're going to call it the Abrahamic covenant? What was the sign of the Abrahamic covenant? All right, chapter 17. Verse 10. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You say, hang on a minute. Unconditional, unconditional, unconditional. Now suddenly God is saying, this is something you have to keep. This is my covenant between you and your offspring after you. And now, are you listening, Abraham? What are you got to do? Circumcise your children. Obviously just the males. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin. And, get this, it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Hang on a minute. There's going to be a tangible, noticeable, demonstrable sign. A sign of the covenant between God and Abraham. And it's for all his descendants. It's circumcision. If you're going to be a descendant of Abraham, you're a male, you've got to be circumcised, according to this. If you're going to be part of the covenant with Abraham, and you say, well, what would you do if someone refused circumcision? What would they be saying if they refused circumcision? Well, they would be saying very, very loudly, very publicly, no way, God. I mean, God is promising blessing, he's promising land, he's promising descendants, innumerable descendants. And he says, the sign of that covenant between me and you is circumcision, Abraham. And so, of course, anyone who refused circumcision was, I'm just going to say, giving the fist to God. And you can add whatever finger signs you think are most appropriate with that. I mean, they are really rebelling, you would say, against God. They are saying, God, we're not interested at all in your blessing or your covenant. And so, of course, if you refuse circumcision, you're cut off from the people of Abraham. I mean, everyone who refuses circumcision was to be cut off. Oh, now, hold on. Now let's go fast forwards. Are you with me? We're asking the question, why is it so significant to keep the Sabbath? Well, I've just read to you that the Sabbath is the sign of the covenant. There it is, right at the heart of the 10 words, the 10 commandments. Right at the heart is the Sabbath command. And in Exodus 31, God says, this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord Yahweh, sanctify you. I set you apart from who? I set you apart as holy from all the peoples of the world. This is what God was doing, wasn't he? He was choosing Israel. He was making Israel his people. And you can read Exodus chapter 19 and verse 6 and see how he was going to make them a kingdom of priests. Their role was to be the mediators for God to the nations of the earth. You can go back to the Abrahamic covenant. You can think about how God said, through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed through your offspring. And you can say, look, this is amazing. God is setting apart his people to be a blessing to everybody. But part of that deal, listen, people of Israel, the Mosaic covenant, the covenant at Mount Sinai, the 10 commandments, and at the heart of it is the command to keep the Sabbath. And that Sabbath command, well, how do you spot an Israelite? Well, I mean, okay, you could spot an Israelite in a number of different ways, but what makes them stand out among the nations? They don't work Saturdays. They stop. That's the point, right? Wherever you go around the world. If you're a Jew, you've got to stop on a Saturday. You can't work. No work. No Saturday work. Neither you, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animal, your ox, your donkey, nor the sojourner within your gates. No, none of it. No work. I mean, that's just like, who does that? The Jews do that. Why? Because God said, it's a Sabbath, it's holy, you've got to do it. And it's a sign. Now, Mr. Jew, you've just heard that. And out you go on a Saturday with your bit of string to get your sticks. What are you saying? What are you saying? You are shaking your fist at God in the most high-handed manner. You are saying to God, I don't want any of it. And it's no surprise then, Exodus 31, that anyone who does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. Why? Because that person is just high-handedly rejecting everything. The Sabbath, you say, is the heart of the Ten Commandments. The heart of the Ten Commandments? Not working on Saturday? Yes, because it's the sign of the covenant between God and his people. Now, what do we take away from that? Well, one principle that you can take away, follow with me if you will for a second, because this is really something. And it's quite a principle to accept. Not every law that is given in the Bible is eternal. We dealt with that. But not every law that is given in the Bible is universal either. To whom was the Sabbath given as a sign? Oh, yeah. I remember teaching this. We memorized it with my Sunday school children. I taught the Ten Commandments to them week in, week out. And I taught it to them from the beginning. You know how it begins, don't you? I memorized it in the NIV, so I'll do you the honor of reading it to you in the ESV instead of paraphrasing it. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And I'm like, doesn't apply to me. Oh, you shall have no other gods before me. Good, that applies. Yeah, okay, that's good. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. Okay, that applies, but, making carved images is not really my deal. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord, okay, right, I'm getting this, getting principles here. This is good. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Excellent, yeah, I get that. And remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Good, yeah, Sundays, I don't work. I don't work on Sundays. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the, seventh day. Well, it changed to the first day of the week somewhere. Did it? Did it? How did it? Oh, I've read books on this. I've read books written to prove that it changed from the seventh day to the first day of the week, to try to argue that. You know what I wrote in those books? Unscriptural argument and words like that. And what? And how do you say that? And question marks and asterisks. And I've beaten my head against that question. How do you get from Saturday to Sunday using just the Bible? Now, go there with tradition, but using just the Bible. It's interesting. But let me come back and ask that question again, why? I'm going to run out of time. Give me a second to gather my thoughts. Okay, let me just try and prove this to you. We'll leave it there and pick it up next week. Not every law is universal, is it? Here is a command which is given to the people of Israel. Now the question is, was it a command given to all people in the world everywhere? Oh, some people would argue, no, it was a creation command and therefore it applies to all people everywhere. But actually that's very interesting because God is very specific. This is going to be the sign of the covenant between me and you to say, Exodus chapter 31, to a sign that I sanctify you. I set you apart, people of Israel. The Sabbath is the sign of the covenant between me and you, the people of Israel. And that really takes some getting over. And I say simply, well, not every law is universal. This was a law for the people of Israel. But was it a law that every Gentile everywhere should keep the Sabbath? Did the Israelites try to enforce that? Well, it was a law that everyone who was a sojourner within their gates did, but they weren't on a mission to go and enforce Sabbath observance around the world. And that's interesting and that's notable, but it's a weak point. Would you say that's a weak point? How would you like a strong point? Not every law is universal. Take circumcision, for example. To whom was the covenant of circumcision given? Well, you say, well, to Abraham and to his descendants. So if you were not a descendant of Abraham, what good did it do you to get circumcised? Did you have to get circumcised? Well, is there anything particular in circumcision that is kind of universal, that everyone should do it? Well, that leaves half of the human population out, for starters, so it's a bit of a downer for the ladies. If you're excluded from the covenant because you can't be circumcised, no, well, it was a sign of the covenant. Abraham and his descendants. And so, okay, when we become children of Abraham by faith, should we be circumcised? Oh, Paul answered that one, didn't he? Paul answered that one very, very loudly. Galatians chapter 5. Do you want to go there very quickly as we close? Galatians chapter 5 and verse 2. Paul says, look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. I testify again, and who's he writing to? Gentile Christians, the Galatians, the Galatians, Turkish, you would say, Christians of the day, not that there was Turkey, but it was modern day Turkey. And he's writing to these mostly Gentile Christians, and he says, in reaction to people who are insisting that they had to be circumcised to be saved, and he says, no. And this doesn't get any more explicit. If you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. Is Paul saying you can be circumcised? What's he saying here? Hold on. He's saying you cannot be circumcised. He's saying to these Gentile Christians, you must not be circumcised. The Jewish Christians have already been circumcised on the 8th day when they're born. But he's saying to the Gentile Christians, you must not accept circumcision. If you do, Christ will be of no advantage to you. Why? Because people were including it with the gospel and perverting the gospel. I testify again, verse 3, to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. Oh boy, you don't want to do that. You're trying to place yourself into the people of Abraham. You're trying to place yourself into the people of Israel. You're going to try and get yourself under the Mosaic law as well, are you? You're mad you can't do that. You don't have to keep the law in order to be saved. Keep the Mosaic law. Keep the Abrahamic covenant in order to be. You don't have to do that in order to be saved. Why? Because we're children of Abraham by faith. Because we're the people of God through Christ by faith. It's not through circumcision. It's not through keeping the law. You're saved by grace. It's a gift. It's through faith. There's a new covenant being made. And it's not like the old covenant. You say, Tom, new covenant with 4 minutes to go. No way. And I say, yeah, no way, Jose. That's going to be next week. How does this all tie together? I'm going to say to you next week, we cannot divide up the Mosaic covenant. But I'm going to say to you next week that the Mosaic covenant is the old covenant and there's a new covenant. And we as the people of God in the New Testament era, as Christians, are not under the law, not under the law of Moses. And that Sabbath keeping, along with the Ten Commandments, along with the whole Mosaic law, is part of the old covenant. And it's the old covenant. You say, the Ten Commandments is the old covenant. So Tom, are you going to say it's okay to murder? No, I'm not going there. You know I'm not going there, don't you? Because Jesus taught about that. Jesus made it very clear in the Sermon on the Mount that the same basic principles apply. In fact, they get stricter. We have to worry about what the thoughts and intents of our hearts. And that lust in the heart is like adultery. You've already done it. Anger in the heart is like murder. You've already done it. It gets more strict for us. But I'm going to say there ain't no mention of Sabbath keeping. Why? Well, the Sabbath was the sign of the Mosaic covenant that God made with his people Israel at Mount Sinai. And that was a long time ago. And that's part of the old covenant that's gone. It's the preacher's problem. What to cut? Let's pray. Father, thank you for this time looking into the Sabbath. And whether we as Christians are under a necessity to keep the Sabbath. I pray that you'd help us as we wrestle with these things. I remember very clearly, very painfully, my own struggle of mind and heart as I wrestled to try to understand if this was indeed true. I pray that you'd help us as we consider these things to be Bereans, to search the scriptures, to see if it's so or not, to be faithful. Lord, we're aware that you have your standards and your principles and your precepts that you do desire us to follow. We thank you that you do write those upon our hearts. And we thank you for the ministry of the Holy Spirit teaching us and leading us and convicting us and causing us even to desire holiness. We pray that we might learn to live to please you, to find out what pleases you. And we pray that we might not be confused by so much that goes under the name Christian but is misplaced in the right understanding of your law. Teach us to be those who rightly divide the word of truth and do so faithfully and not trying to justify ourselves but trying to honestly follow you. We ask it for Jesus' sake. Amen.